Okay, this video is for the digestive system. I think that if you already read the presentation, you will notice that there's a lot that is going on that is just repeating itself. Um, because, as I said multiple times, the body is actually pretty simple if you analyze it from a principles standpoint. It doesn't have 100 different tricks to it. There are patterns. And yes, you can use multiple molecules and in different places in the body, and that makes us think that the body is very complex. It's not complex. It's diverse. There's a difference, and obviously there's a lot going on at the same time. But a lot of it could be broken down to the same basic principles. So I'm not going to go over every word in the presentation. Notice on slide 4 you have the pages that I'm not addressing in the presentation. I'm not going to explain about cancer each and every time again, or about at this point, especially at this point, at the last 2 weeks of the course. I hope when I say infection, 1,000 things come to mind in the right order and way. And if not, just send me an email. Okay, so I'm jumping straight to slide number 10. The digestive system from a metabolic standpoint is usually regarded by exercise physiologists as outside of the body because it does not affect directly cellular metabolism, and that's one of the principles of metabolism and exercise physiology. Of course, it has a great effect on the body because everything that's coming in nutrition wise that needs to be digested is coming through that system. So it's obvious that it has an effect, and it can have multiple effects. Our body's systems and organs and processes are connected. Then, regarding anorexia, you can see that I started out by teaching you a bit of Greek. So, anorexia, by definition, is the loss of appetite, meaning that you're eating less. This, of course, influences metabolism, it influences body weight and body composition. And if you are lacking the nutrients needed to function, it's going to affect function, especially the brain and muscles. Notice that anorexia is a symptom and not a disease. It's associated with nausea, abdominal pain, diarrhea, and psychological stress. Anorexia definitely has a very strong, prominent, dominant component that is psychological. Anything that has to do with body image, self-image, self-confidence, social expectations, the expectation of someone being slim, although they're not, definitely plays a part in anorexia. And when I say social, that can also be in your close circles and your support group. Then we have vomiting, which is, kind of simple to understand, the idea that you are expelling food through your mouth. Obviously, you have to push that food upwards within the system from the stomach upwards, and you have to overcome any resistance on the way. I can tell, as you know, vomiting doesn't always work the first time. Sometimes it goes up and comes down. So the end process is the ability to overcome all of the tissues and organs and opposing forces on the way. What else? That's obviously when you elevate pressure from your stomach upwards, you are dealing with the vagus nerve. And the vagus nerve is a major nerve that influences sensations of fullness. Um, it has connections to the diaphragm and respiratory muscles. And that is a major nerve that just crosses half of your body and has a great influence on metabolism and mindset, and of course anything to do with the stomach. So if you have an upset vagus nerve, so to speak, you're asking for it. um, you can see that we have spontaneous vomiting, that it's not preceded by nausea or retching. uh, this is usually because of a direct stimulus of the vomiting center in the brain, meaning that the process is starting from the upper side and not from the lower side. Okay. Talking about constipation, constipation can be life threatening. Constipation means that you're not releasing substances from your body as you should. That accumulates in the body, and that can cause muscles to contract and mechanical pressure to increase. And I made sure to write to you that 145 people uh, die every day, year from a direct consequence of constipation. Some try to, especially in the obese, and the higher your obesity, the worse it is. If you're constipated, and they're constipated regularly, by the way, um, you're trying to push something out. It's not going out because there's a blockage there. Mechanical pressure goes up to where it might overcome the stability of tissues and organs, and they will explode and you will die. And that happens. So, uh, uh, abdominal pressure becomes so great that organs and tissues just explode, literally, or cave in mechanically, and the end point is death. You bleed out to death. Um, what else? You can see subtypes of constipation. I think they're pretty easy to understand. When you're talking about normal transit constipation, um, you have a normal rate of passage, but you're not evacuating easily. Then you have slow transit constipation, meaning that the colon motor activity is impaired. You have infrequent bowel movement, straining to defecate, uh, mild abdominal distension, and so on. So you don't have a normal rate, and you don't have a normal process of releasing yourself. Then secondary is obviously with an underlying cause, which really depends on the condition that is affecting the reason why you cannot, evacuate. You can see that the vast majority of constipations are neurologically based. Of course, diet will change the content of your feces, and can make it easier or harder to get out. Of course, indirect influences, or what we call environmental influences, include lifestyle and exercise. Um, a diet with high charged ions, such as +2 and +3. Obviously, in this case, we can talk about calcium and iron. Um, increases constipation because they're highly active, and they tend to connect to other substances and make them solid. So that would make it harder for you to let go. Of course, the endocrine system is going to increase or decrease the chances of constipation. I'm sure you understand the idea by now. And you can see that you have a full list of reasons on page 895 if you're looking at the fifth edition. By the way, I'm using the fifth edition. The newer editions, I don't think, added anything substantial. Um, so you see that symptoms should include at least two of the following for 3 months in a row. So that is how it would be diagnosed, right? And you can see that there's a constant that these symptoms have to be occurring for at least 25% of the time. Um, of course, by the way, one of the principles in medicine is that while something might not be normal for others, it might unlikely be normal for you. And that's why it's important for you to know your body and know if this is normal or not. Uh, and this is right for something that you think might be cancerous to bowel movement and so on and so forth. Example: let's say since you've been a child, you've always gone to the bathroom 5 times a day, and there's no indications that it's not normal. Although it's above average for you, it's normal. So if there's no symptoms implying clinical conditions, for you that would be normal. But it's abnormal in relations to the population and average. Okay. So any change in patterns or something that is out of the usual for you specifically to what you're used to, um, assuming that you don't have a clinical condition, should be alarming. Of course, you might have had a clinical condition for years and not noticing, and you think that the abnormal is normal. So, of course, both ideas have to be taken into consideration. Then we can talk about diarrhea. Obviously, in diarrhea, the volume of fluids goes up. The poop is more fluid than solid, and there's multiple ways to cause that. Then you can see that more than 3 times a day is abnormal. Um, Influencing factors: colon, water content, non-absorbed food or materials, and intestinal secretions. So anything that plays with that ratio between solids and fluids in your poop. You can see that an average of 150 milliliters of water are excreted daily under normal conditions. So anything above that is abnormal. And of course, when you lose fluids from the body, you are taking that balance to a negative place. You might be leading to dehydration. That's why when someone has diarrhea, it's very important to drink a lot of water, obviously. Of course, if we're talking about large volume diarrhea, we're talking about the volume of feces is increased uh, mainly by water. Okay, it can also be increased because we're talking about volume through the solids, but mostly water usually. Then you have small volume diarrhea. Um, we can see that while the volume itself stays the same, you are pooping more times and it's a bit more watery. So there's no change to the volume, but there's change to content, bottom line. And then we see 3 mechanisms that cause diarrhea. The first one is the osmotic diarrhea, meaning that you have change to content and gradients, right? So we know about osmotic pressure and its counteracting pressure. You've learned this in the first chapters of the course. You can see the biological ways of causing this. Of course, you can have problem with non-absorbed substances that lead to excessive water retention, and of course, resulting in stool weight and volume increase. Then you can see that lactase and pancreatic enzyme deficiency, excessive synthetic non-absorbable sugars to the intestine, full strength tube feeding formulas, or dumping syndrome usually due to surgery of the intestine, of the gastric duct, gastrointestinal intestine duct, the GI duct tract, sorry, may lead to this. So basically, surgery. Of course, we have mucosal membranes that might be over secreting fluids and electrolytes. Um, and of course, any immuno process due to infections and bacteria, viruses and bacteria, may result in medical treatment that might lead uh, to diarrhea. Um, then we see the mutility diarrhea, which is looking more at the organ and its normal function at a physiological and biological level. So you see the improper mixing of food, and that is when digestion and absorption are impaired. You have a list of causes that you can go over. It can be acute or chronic. And if it is untreated and has an underlying um, cause that makes it worse, it might become systematic, such as dehydration, okay? Electrolyte deficiency that will involve immediately the nervous system, and of course, weight loss. You can see that symptoms might include fever, cramping pain, skin irritation, and bloody stools. Bloody stools usually mean that you have a blood vessel that has been affected somewhere in the system, right? When we talk about fat in the stools, bloating, and diarrhea are all common signs of malabsorption syndromes, meaning that something in the body, there's multiple syndromes, is preventing you from absorbing food or the outcomes of digestion in the appropriate manner and extent. Abdominal pain. Just remember that pain means that you have some kind of applied pressure on a nerve that is sensed, meaning that the nerve is able to sense it and that the pressure is applied to the nerve. It's usually a presenting symptom that can be either acute or chronic in several diseases, and you'll see that abdominal pain is definitely a leading symptom of digestive disorders and diseases. You can see that the main cause is mechanical. Of course, it can be inflammatory, but I would say that inflammation and ischemia are more the outcomes that make it worse than the initial initiator of the pain. So 99% you'll see that mechanical pressure is elevated, causing cell injury and tissue injury, which leads to inflammation. And by that, if the cell injury is to a blood vessel, then ischemia as well. You see that internal organs are bombarded with neural sensors. It's very important to normal function, the ability to sense changes, both chemical and mechanical. You know this by now. So, for instance, the stomach is simply coated with lots and lots and lots of mechanical pressure, especially tension receptors. So that makes it those whole organs are very sensitive to changes in mechanical pressure, and that has a role to play in the pathologies that we will talk about. The nervous system as a whole, regardless of the digestive system itself, is very sensitive to rapid changes, because the nervous system, as I explained to you in one of the first topics, units, is constantly measuring the difference between 2 points. And if this change occurs really fast, it's easier to calculate and sense. That immediately sends a warning to the system. Um, let's see something that you don't know already or haven't talked. Again, I think that these are pretty simple points. By the way, preparing the presentation, I was like, yeah, they should know this, they should know this by now. So you definitely have accumulated a lot of knowledge about the principles of the body, and that should make everything easier. Then you see three major sorts of pain identified on slide 39. We have the parietal pain, we have the visceral pain, and we have the referred pain. We talked about referred pain when we talked about cancer. Then you see that with the visceral pain, um, it's due to a stimulus of an abdominal organ. It's poorly localized, includes a radiating pattern, and may include referred pain. Um, it is diffused and vague, and then you see that the first kind of pain originates from the parietal peritoneum. It's localized, intense, and it is lateral, meaning that it tends to be in one side more than the other. Um, okay. GI bleeding, very simple idea. Mechanical pressure, chemical toxins, cell injury somehow occurs to a blood vessel, which causes a different level of release of blood, hemorrhage. In this case, obviously, it has to be located in the GI tract. Um, so, if you look anatomically, you can uh, divide grossly the tract to upper levels and lower levels. That's what we're talking about here on slide 41. According to the location, the content of substances that could be influencing the blood and what you see um, changes from lighter in the upper parts to darker in the lower parts. Um, so we see that causes may include polyps and inflammation of the colon wall, any other inflammation, disease, cancer, or hemorrhoids, basically any mass that increases mechanical pressure and causes cell injury to the environment. And this is going to occur again and again and again. Then you can see that we can talk about occult bleeding that is due to a slow, chronic, non-obvious blood loss resulting in iron deficiency anemia, right? So we know that iron is important um, in several processes in the muscles, in hemoglobin, which would, of course, decrease oxygen uh, um, delivery and carriage and lead to hypoxia and ischemia. Um, and you can see that can go all the way up to being life threatening on slide 46. Excuse me. Of course, the worse the bleeding and the cell and tissue injury, the closer you get to dying. Obviously, changes to blood volume and flow can mean changes to blood pressure, oxygenation, heart rate, and cardiac output. That's a very simple idea. And the decrease in blood flow to the area in order to not lose more blood through an injury, a wound that you have inside in a blood vessel is the first response of the body. And that can lead to a wide scale changes in the body, including to the brain, meaning that one can suffer from changes to psychological and neural processes. Let's see. If untreated, you're losing blood, you're going towards what we studied as hypovolemic shock, meaning decrease in blood volume that leads to shock. Since it's originating in the digestive system, it will influence the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is one of the greater inducers of vomiting, and it will also influence processes going downwards. So diarrhea will also uh, be one of the major symptoms. So those are the two first ones, including blood in your feces and in your vomiting. Um, then, of course, you might have a metabolic and chemical imbalance leading to the increase of certain gases, such as bun that we've learned about in the renal system, and that might be a symptom and an indicator. Uh, because you're digesting blood, bun is going to increase. Motility disorders, meaning more on the motor side of things and movement of the organs needed in order to produce movement within the system. Okay, that can include most likely smooth muscles, right? So if we're talking about dysphagia or dysphagia, uh, it is defined as a difficulty to swallow. Um, Causes may include mechanical obstructions or any functional problem in moving content through the esophagus. You can see that intrinsic causes are from within, and extrinsic causes are from outside. So, for instance, if you have an obstruction within the tract, okay, or a duct or a vessel, that's intrinsic. If you have a mass such as, God forbid, a cancer tumor from outside pushing on the pipe, so to speak, that would be extrinsic. You can see that we can talk about functional dysphagia, which would be neural or muscular. Obviously, usually muscles are activated by the nervous system, so it comes together. Then you see the rare idiopathic form of dysphagia, achalasia, um, which also has an autoimmune background to it. When we talk about an obstruction, if you remember when we were talking, for instance, on a blood vessel, or when we were talking about the renal system, then let's say that if this is the part of the system that we're looking at, and things are supposed to advance downwards as they should, and there's an obstruction right here in the middle, then content that's supposed to continue downwards is being accumulated somewhere in the upper part above the obstruction, which is relative to the direction of movement, and will increase uh, um, the pressure in the area that might lead to cell injury. Of course, the obstruction opposes a certain amount of resistance, and once you can overcome that, then it should continue in the system. Naturally, it decreases the average of content moving through the system normally and increases the power, the forces needed to push it forward so it gets to where it's supposed to get. And then we can also talk about a psychological stress related version that exists as well. As you know, the HPA axis is the one that connects, in general, it's way more complex than what I'm saying here, but in general, it's the connection, it's the biological connection between psych and physiology. And then you see the symptoms on slide 52. Okay, I'm gonna stop the video here. There will be multiple videos, and we'll continue from slide 53 in a few seconds.